Everybody. So today I'm going to talk about an issue that I actually wrote my senior thesis on. It's something you probably have not heard of a lot, but it in political circles is a very concerning trend and issue that we're seeing in Eastern Europe, and that specifically is the rise in authoritarianism in Hungary and Poland. Um, and there's fear that this could create a domino effect and threaten the European Union and the role that it plays in the world. Um, so I just think personally that these two countries were part of the Soviet Union. So they both had a history of communist occupation and suppression. So in the 1980s and 90s, they decided to be democratic. Through the peaceful protests, they were able to gain independence. During the 1980s and 90s, um, they were able to have markets open and grow their economy, and they're able to gain admittance into the EU and NATO. And this allowed for them to really be able to grow exponentially. But then in 2010 in Hungary, in 2015 and 2016 in Poland, something happened. And they both began to take steps towards authoritarianism. And one of the major reasons for this is that following the creation of their constitutions, it became clear that they were transitional constitutions. They were not legally binding. So, following the elections in these two respective countries, these leaders recognized this and worked to subvert it. And in the case of Hungary, abolish the transitional constitution. So, in Hungary in 2010, Viktor Orban um, and his right wing party came to power. And they immediately passed this new constitution, which they referred to as the fundamental law, which was this conservative, Christian based constitution that really worked to subvert the role and the authority of independent bodies in the government. And it would centralize all power around him and his party. And then in 2015 and 2016, Poland followed the same roadmap. While in Hungary, the government and Orban's party got elected with like 60% of the vote, Poland and the Law and Justice Party got, I believe it was 40 to 45% of the vote. But due to the prevalence of many different parties in Poland, they were able to form a ruling government. And they, while not abolishing the Constitution, passed several judicial reform bills that called into question the legitimacy of the Constitution and allowed for them to be able to centralize their power. And in both countries, one of the ways that they were able to do this was through the use of judicial reform. So in both countries, they were able to limit the scope and jurisdiction of both the Supreme Courts, provincial courts, and local courts. This new legislation and constitution overturned decades of decisions. Basically, every decision from when they were able to be a new country following the fall of the Soviet Union was overturned. And this was abolished, this overturned rulings that supported LGBT rights, women's rights, basic human rights, and basic democratic norms. And it also allowed for the elimination of the last checks on power in both Hungary and Poland, as they were able to successfully politicize the judiciary. Both these countries now were able to nominate and approve any justice that they wanted without any checks. So they're able to appoint young, radical party loyalists that would be on the court for decades and continue to give them favorable judicial decisions. In addition to the rulings and the judicial rulings that they had, they also were able to successfully control the media. Hungary, they were able to use the state-run media to build support around this idea of a single Hungarian nation. By doing this, they're able to remind people of the horrors of the past, specifically through the period of communism and Soviet occupation that they endured for several decades. And they were also able to use it to target the EU and any political opponents that they had. In Poland, instead, they were able to appeal to their base, which they refer to as ignorant peasants, because these are people that are really not well educated, that live in rural areas and don't have a lot of faith in government. They're not um, able to have readily available news outlets. So through the use of state media, they're able to build massive amounts of support in rural areas that offsets the opposition that they face in cities. So through the use of these state-run media, they're able to control the political narrative, suppress voices of their opponents, and build support in these critical areas, rural areas across Poland and in Hungary. And in Poland, also, they're able to use and spread conspiracy theories to delegitimize their opponents. Um, some of the tactics that they employ, unfortunately, Hungary has used a lot of anti-Semitism, specifically directed at George Soros, who is a billionaire philanthropist who founded this university that is based in Budapest. Unfortunately, because of the rise in authoritarianism, it has had to move to, I believe it's Geneva. And they are able to build support and unity through anti-Semitism and Islamophobia around the Hungarian Christian identity. But in Poland, however, they've really been hesitant to use and reject. They've actually rejected anti-Semitism due to their past history of being having two of the most prominent Nazi concentration camps in Poland during World War II. Instead, as I said earlier, they're able to use conspiracy theories to delegitimize their opponents, and they've also used anti-LGBT rhetoric because, as many of you know, Pope John Paul II was from Poland. So Poland has now become this very conservative Catholic country. And now they're able to use this anti-LGBT, anti-Islamic rhetoric to develop or LGBT free zones, which ban LGBT people from being in certain cities or certain areas at certain times. And all of this has really caused a lot of alarm throughout the European Union, because the European Union bases itself on the rule of law and democracy. Because of this, there have been calls through various countries in Europe to either sanction Hungary and Poland or outright kick them out. Unfortunately, the EU is very limited with what they can do. There is one article that they can have that begins the process of kicking out certain member states. However, it is very convoluted, it is very complicated, and it really won't work because it has to be unanimous. So, for example, if they vote to kick out Hungary, Poland can veto and vice versa. But what they can do is they can reduce funding in these two countries by not allowing EU funds to flow. Both these countries are incredibly dependent on EU funds, as they prop up their economy, even though they're very critical of the EU. Both these leaders, though, know it, so they've been trying to toe a very fine line with the European Union and trying to retain the funds while appealing to their base and being vocally opposed to other immigration policies and other policies by the EU. And because of this, the EU is very powerless to stop them because of the veto power and also the long process, because they don't really know what's going to happen. And that really is the tough thing about this, because nobody really knows what's going to happen because this process has really only been the last decade or so. And while there's fear, there's also some optimism. I'm going to go into the fear first and then try to leave everybody, as like every TED Talk, on a more optimistic note. So because of the coronavirus pandemic, Viktor Orban is a master politician, and he knew that through the emergency decrees used by the coronavirus pandemic, he was able to fully centralize power around himself. And he is able to now, he was able to ram through this legislation that allows him to rule by decree and basically suspend parliament, suspend elections, suspend judicial decisions, and say that anybody that, according to the government, promotes false information can get thrown in prison without any cause. This, rightfully so, has caused panic in the European Union. But as I said earlier, they are virtually powerless to do anything because Poland will support Hungary no matter what. On the bright side, though, there is now in Poland, they are now able to have presidential elections still, and they have not suspended parliament, which is good. So there have been significant protest movements against this government because the government really only has like 40 to 45% of the seats and 40 to 45% of public support. So there have been able to be widespread protests throughout Poland against the actions of the government. And there is a presidential election, I believe, later in May. But the government of Poland and the president has requested that this election still go on, despite the coronavirus pandemic raging through Europe. The reason for this is that he wants to suppress the voter turnout to be able to win another term, even though the legitimacy of the election is questioned. While the other opposing parties have been very hesitant to form a coalition with the main opposition party, they have decided to do that now and run one candidate, and they've been vocally opposed to the election happening, and that it is they've been calling for it to be postponed. There hasn't been a final decision made yet, but it is heartening to see the in Poland the massive protests against this government, because it shows the world and it shows the leaders of Poland people are not happy. And I think that this is something that we're going to have to watch, because in Hungary, with this emergency decree, protests are banned. And I think that the EU has to be bolder in what it can do to prevent this from happening, because if both these countries become dictatorships, there is the possibility that a domino effect could happen in countries all throughout Eastern Europe that were former Soviet bloc countries. And the EU could cease to exist as we know it, and Europe could be forever changed. So while it's not being discussed overly much in the media in the United States, I've been talking to family in Ireland and friends across Europe. They're concerned. And I think that this is something that needs to be highlighted and talked about more to prevent Orban and the Law and Justice Party in Poland from being able to subtly transition to a democracy. And I think that really there needs to be widespread global opposition about this. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out in the discussion post. But I hope that you all enjoyed this TED Talk.